Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to just address the author of this underlying legislation, which I strongly oppose unamended, and it's perhaps well-intentioned, and we all oppose Islamophobia or any kind of discrimination based on race or religion. But this bill is so poorly drafted that if it's not amended to provide some definitional restrictions, then I'm very concerned that this will not only confuse anyone who's following U.S. foreign policy, but it would compromise U.S. counterterrorism efforts, and it would undermine our national security. And I would just say, I compliment Mr. Shabbat for the amendment that would attempt to provide some definitional clarity as to what Islamophobia actually means. And I would question anyone who would vote against that amendment. And if they do, I would ask that member, what is this bill truly about if you don't vote for the Shabbat amendment, which would provide some definition? What we need in this country is moral clarity. We desperately need moral clarity. We don't need nuance on the issue of radical Islamic terrorism. We need intellectual and moral clarity. And maybe people think that's politically incorrect to say this, but our enemy is radical Islamic terrorism. And we are at war, and we've been at war since before 9/11. And if you can't even acknowledge who the enemy is, or that we are at war with them, then how can you expect to defeat that enemy? We must face the truth that there is a very real struggle within the Islamic world between religious tolerance, which is perhaps the goal of this bill, and an evil, toxic intolerance. And if we can't define the kind of Islam that is radical intolerance, then we are making a big mistake. We have to have clarity. We must acknowledge that there is, to a certain extent, this is more than just a perverted version of the Islamic religion. It is an evil ideology that says that if you are a Christian, or if you are a Jew, or if you are a moderate Muslim, then you should be destroyed. This ideology of evil and extreme religious intolerance must be confronted with clarity as much as each individual act of terrorism. And undefined Islamophobia threatens to encourage the very extremism that we all say we oppose. The Islamic terrorist threat is not just a fringe minority within the Muslim world. It is an evil and extreme ideology of religious intolerance, and it is a growing global threat to the United States and her allies. Disengagement and appeasement by saying we are against Islamophobia but not defining it is a huge problem. We must deal with this problem as it is, not as we would hope it to be. History teaches us that when Islamic extremists and jihadists are not fought, they grow. Their movement metastasizes. The longer they are not confronted, the more they become emboldened. They overrun territory, and regimes in the areas they occupy and secure are safe havens from which they can launch attacks against the United States. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have made the argument that we do need a definition, because they themselves have called some of the members on this side of the aisle and the amendments that we are offering to this bill Islamophobic. Is Mr. Shabbat's amendment that provides definition to what Islamophobic is that Islamophobic? Members are doing their job by offering amendments, and a member of this committee just went cavalier at labeling something that she disagrees with as Islamophobic. If members of other governments had the same debate abroad, would they now be subject to this crazy political correctness? And what I would say is, look, we do have an envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, but the way this bill is structured and the lack of definition of Islamophobia sets this office up to undermine the very mission of the envoy to monitor and combat Islamophobia. This bill without definitional or anti-Semitism. This bill, without definitional restraints, will invite anti-Semitic and anti-Christian bias into State Department decision-making concealed as combating Islamophobia. That's what this will do without definition. So maybe this was well-intentioned. Maybe we will have some bipartisan agreement on providing some definition so that we can really combat Islamophobia. But if we don't agree to some kind of definition and we don't provide some clarity, moral clarity, intellectual clarity to what this is, then what we have here in this bill is a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is a wolf in sheep's clothing is what this bill is. And it invites the kind of nuance that will not help us defeat our enemy. With that, I yield back.